As the Andrew H. and Janet Dayton Neely Dean of River Campus Libraries, I'm really thrilled to be here tonight to introduce our introducer of the guest speaker and to welcome you here. It's really going to be a special evening tonight. We're really sure that we'll have an enriching talk and a wonderful conversation afterwards. So thank you for attending, especially on a crisp evening. To introduce our speaker tonight is Annette Weld, who's a real friend of the River Campus Libraries, and Annette is also an alumnus of the University of Rochester, receiving an MA and PhD in English. Annette, take it away.
Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see such a smiling crowd here. First, there were her 2 books of poetry. Then, a slim novel that captured Canada's prestigious Giller Prize. Next, a collection of short stories in the grand tradition of Canadian women authors. In the works, another short novel, maybe short, maybe not, I don't know that, and a collection of literary essays. Johanna Skibsrud, our evening's Neely Series speaker, is not yet 35 years old. Tonight she'll share with us the process of creating her prize-winning novel, The Sentimentalists, an understated semi-autobiographical account of the relation between an aging Vietnam veteran and his daughter. The narrative mirrors the sliding boundaries between fact and fiction, hopscotching among the memories and moving forward while looking back. The language in the early part of the book is languid and melancholy, complex and poetic. Metaphors abound. A new lake that drowned an old town. An unfinished boat named after a bird. These and other images shape a narrative from her childhood memories and her father's post-traumatic flashbacks. The last third of the novel presents a starkly bare trial transcript based on Vietnam-era documents that ultimately answers no questions neatly. Perhaps there are many truths. When asked in an interview about the genesis of her work, I have Skibsrud written down here, but I'm going to say Johanna, because I've sat next to her now. Johanna responded, "My mother thinks that my father told me his stories because he knew that I would do something with them. What I did write, though, is not my father's story, but my own. And it's not a true story. At its root, though, there are 2 true things. One is my father's testimony in 1967, in which he spoke out about the murder of a civilian. The other is the feeling that I got floating over the buried towns in Flagstaff Lake, a feeling of the way that everything exists in layers, that nothing disappears, it just gets hidden sometimes." Please help me welcome Johanna.
Thank you. Oh, do I have to turn myself on now? Is that working? Okay. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I'm just an honor to be a part of the Neely series. So thank you to Andrea, to Mary Ann. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And it's quite perfect that you've set up the novel, because I'm going to be talking about the novel tonight. My talk, Illuminating the Shadows, a Space Between Fact and Fiction. It's a version of an essay that will be coming out later this year in a book of essays on writing a first novel. And I was charged with the task of thinking about and writing about inspiration. And I thought, originally, anyway, this piece sort of became something very different than I thought it would be from that initial task of thinking about inspiration. I had to think about a lot more than I thought: why I write, how I write, why I write, what I write, and I'm going to share some of that with you. Some of it is very specific about how I wrote my first novel, which we heard a little bit about, and a lot of it is just sort of more about inspiration in general, which I hope will speak to a lot of you, whether or not you're a writer or not. So I'll just begin, and then afterwards I will be very happy to take any questions or comments. So in the summer of 2003, I was 23 years old and working as a canoe and backpacking instructor in northern Maine, USA. I said that because the essay is coming out in the UK, so I think you all know where northern Maine is. Flagstaff Lake was one of the many lakes that I paddled that summer, a man-made lake. It was created as a result of a hydroelectric dam that was introduced to the area in the mid-1950s. The houses of the small settlement had been, as with many other settlements in the region during that time, either destroyed or relocated to form a small community nearby. Traces of the original town, which now lies submerged below the lake, are still visible above the waterline. And anyone who's read the book, these sort of exact images emerge in the fictional town that I created. Long poles stick out of the water, marking the old foundations of the relocated homes. A road beginning on one side of an island disappears back into the water again on the other without apparently leading anywhere at all. Finally, and most evocatively, though it had long since disappeared from view, an old church steeple was rumored to have remained for many years partially visible above the waterline, as though floating on the waves. These traces caught and held my imagination that summer. I was fascinated by the way that the lake's present, that which was visible and encounterable on the surface of the water, was literally marked by the past, that which lay beneath. As I dipped my paddle into the water, it seemed that I could actually feel in the water's perfect combination of resistance and give the history that the lake contained. I think most of my writing, my best writing certainly, begins with a single moment like that, like a photograph, offers a sudden illumination and consequent shape to an experience that it otherwise might not have held. And just like a photograph that you know too well, it sometimes becomes difficult to tell what came first, the experience itself or its figuration. Is there actually something essential within the moment itself, something toward which afterwards you can't help wanting to return? Or do such moments of sudden illumination indicate that the figuration process has already begun, that without realizing it, the image, idea, or experience has already become a story? The following fall, recently enrolled in the MA program in English and Creative Writing at Concordia University in Montreal, I began working on my debut novel, The Sentimentalists, in which my unnamed narrator experiences a very similar revelation to the one I had experienced the summer before. Floating one day over the remains of the imaginary submerged town of Casablanca, modeled after Flagstaff Lake, although I moved the town up into the southern Ontario region, and for those of you who are familiar with the lost towns, they're towns that were flooded or by the St. Lawrence Seaway project, and there was just massive relocation projects, and that really captured my imagination to this idea of a whole region referred to as the lost towns. So now we're up in the fictional town of Casablanca. She contemplates, my character, contemplates the congruencies between water and time, both of which may manage to obscure, but never to completely absorb, obliterate, or replace the past. So this is an excerpt. One afternoon, I took the boat out on my own to the far end of the disappearing road where Henry's old place would have been. I stopped there, letting the boat drift slightly. Then I lay back on a pile of life jackets so that my head rested on the deck of the bow. I imagined the house below me, still standing like the old dock of the film, and the dam, too, that the grandfather built, still holding some things in and some things out. It's funny to think about, the way the whole world is disappearing like that, that every moment we get closer until, and inevitably, there comes that one instant, that impetus, whatever it will be, by which we are one day blown, finally, from our furthest extremity, like leaves from a thin branch at the end of a tree. So that in coming to live as we do at such a far remove from ourselves, it becomes possible, no, unavoidable at times, to float over certain essential objects without noticing them at all. As just in that moment, for example, I, in Henry's boat, bobbed over Henry's old house, from which vantage point I might have seen, if unobstructed, all the way down to the ruins of the grandfather's dam below. Time, it seemed, at once material, at once not, existed there in that in-between, in the way I might have, but could not see down. The first character that I conceived was not my narrator, however, but Henry, an eccentric old man living in Casablanca, the new town built on the shores of the lake that now covers his original family home. What would it be like, I asked myself, to live alongside such a constant physical reminder of what you had lost? I was in the very early stages of working out this idea when, in what seems to me now a poignant coincidence, my father began to tell me about his experiences as a U.S. Marine in the Vietnam War. These were experiences he had not spoken of to anyone for over 30 years. In the fall of 1967, my father had been involved in the still controversial incident at Quang Tri, where he had witnessed the murder of a civilian woman at the hands of his commanding officer. My father had been so unsettled by the experience that he later reported the murder to the company chaplain, his report sparking a criminal investigation at which he was asked to testify. He was separated from his unit during this time, due in part to threats that had been made on his life, and given the solitary job of sorting through the bags of those soldiers who had been killed in action, making sure that no unsavory articles, drugs, pornography, or military souvenirs made their way back to the grieving families. At night, he slept with his gun. He never spoke of this experience after the war, attempting to forget that he had ever been involved in the conflict at all. In the early 1970s, he relocated to Canada with my mother, and when it was assumed, as it often was, that he was a draft dodger, he would let it go at that. Because of this, when my father first spoke to me of the incident of Quang Tri, he was able to remember very little. Most of the details, having been buried for so long and at such a remove, had long since disappeared. The emotional trauma of the experience and the guilt associated with it had, on the other hand, remained. The intersection between my father's real-life stories and the themes already emerging in my novel, first inspired by Flagstaff Lake, were immediately apparent. Buried history and memory, the always implicit presence of the past in the present. But how was I to demonstrate this intersection? How was I to expose the differences as well as the similarities between Henry's fictional story and my father's true one? How was I, through that exposure, to express the inherent truth that I felt existed in between? I began piecing together the answers to these questions from the perspective most familiar to me. For my main character, I chose a young woman of roughly my own age who, at a turning point in her life, goes to live at the lake house I had already constructed in the imaginary town of Casablanca with Henry and her father, Napoleon. Henry became the father of Owen, a friend of Napoleon's who had been killed in the Vietnam War. After the war, Napoleon finally succeeds in tracking Henry down, and he becomes an integral part of the family. Every summer of the narrator's childhood is subsequently spent at the lake house in Casablanca, a place which becomes, as the narrator recounts, what all of us, including my father, secretly thought of as home. Though the first half of The Sentimentalists is told solely from her perspective, the narrator remains unnamed. We are introduced to the lake and the narrator's early memories of it, to her family and its dissolution. Napoleon is a restless, damaged character who disappears from his daughter's life during her adolescence, only to resurface again years later. The question of Napoleon's connection with Henry and the details of his life over the course of his disappearance have remained a mystery to the narrator, but the connection that she has with her father, as well as to the lake and her nostalgic memories of it, have continued to sustain her. When she is forced to reevaluate her own life after a traumatic breakup, she flees to Casablanca, hoping to regain something there that she feels has been lost. Over the course of the summer that the narrator spends with Henry and Napoleon at the lake house, both men's stories emerge. The narrative switches from first person to third person, and we are taken back in time to 1959, the year that the introduction of the hydroelectric dam forced Henry to relocate from his original home, and to 1967, the year of the incident of Quang Tri. In each successive draft of the novel, emphasis on the details of the narrative's personal life decreased significantly. Eventually, and due to the sudden and extreme dislocation from her ordinary life and that the breakup and subsequent retreat to Casablanca allowed, she is stripped almost entirely of her private concerns, becoming instead the conduit for her father's and Henry's stories, as well as a source of illumination for the intersections between them. Increasingly, as I revised, the unreliability of both experience and memory, and, by implication, the constructed nature of history emerged as the novel's dominant theme. A crucial addition to the final draft of the novel was the introduction of an excerpt from my father's real-life testimony at the military investigation into the incident at Quang Tri, which I have included in the epilogue of the novel. I've just changed the names and condensed it, but the transcript itself is word for word. The transcript was given to me by my father, who had himself received it from an historian investigating the affair. But in the novel, the transcript is only discovered by the narrator after her father's death. The introduction of the testimony at the end of the novel serves to disrupt any notion of having established the truth about her father's or Henry's, or by extension even her own experiences, opening up a space that I like to think of as existing between fact and fiction, the space in which we actually live. The real-life document fails, of course, to account for the fictional elements of the story with which the narrator and the reader had become acquainted. Most conspicuously omitted is any mention of Owen, the absent connective thread between Napoleon and Henry. Both narrator and reader are therefore left with many more questions than answers, but also, I hope, a sense of the power that stories have to shape and continuously reshape our lives. The power, that is, not only of those stories that are suddenly illuminated and take shape either in our lives or on the page, but also, conversely, of those that never will, that have been left in shadow, forgotten, or concealed. In all, 7 years passed between the first moment of inspiration and the fall of 2009, when The Sentimentalists was first published by a small press in Nova Scotia. Each time I returned to the manuscript, I had to re-ask myself the question of what the novel was really about, and each time realized more surely that it was about the space between fact and fiction, as well as the simple revelation of the palimpsest of history I felt as I canoed over Flagstaff Lake. The task, of course, as in any creative project, I think, was to be able to express this in a story that could exist outside of that instant and the personal context from which it arose, something that, in being brought to the surface, would not actually be reduced to that surface. Toward the end of my novel, the narrator is confronted by her own high school-era poem, which her father, Napoleon, stumbles across in the drawer. When Napoleon reads it out to her, she is embarrassed by what she sees as its simplicity and superficiality, and, in other words, its surface quality. When her father praises it, calling it a nice little poem, she bitingly replies, "I don't want to have written a nice little poem." Her father is untroubled by the bitterness of her tone, so, he says, write another. But don't be too sad. Be like Whitman. I like it when you're like Whitman. He always made the most of everything. This advice to focus on the process of writing rather than the product points, I hope, both to the perpetual inadequacy of language. How is it possible, after all, to truly communicate any experience, as well as to its saving power? There is perhaps no more worthwhile endeavor than to try, to make the most of the potential that we have to shape, communicate, and therefore learn from our personal as well as our collective experience. Similarly, the novel as a whole, with its layered stories and multiple perspectives and narrative styles, the shift from third person to first person in the sections that relate to experiences of Henry and Napoleon, for example, points to the idea that no one truth about an experience may ever be established or expressed, while at the same time refusing to undermine the attempt. And so the narrator concludes in the novel's epilogue, acknowledging the limitations of both language and expression. In these pages, I have also tried to record what I know to be true, the truth anyway as it exists at this, my own personal intersection of it, at this singular and otherwise obscure point along its complicated and transitional course. As it pauses here, I mean, almost imperceptibly and for only so long before continuing on in its uncountable directions. In many ways, I see this exposition by the narrator as a comment on my own process of creating the novel itself. From a complicated network of stories that evolved from a single moment, the process very quickly became one of locating the pauses, the characters, scenes, and conversations that were essential to conveying the story and the impulse at its root. There is perhaps a perpetual imbalance between the inspiration behind a work and what is eventually produced. Even those moments that seem to arrive already written in a single instant, as though almost whole, must often be disassembled before they can be pieced back together on the page in a way that might actually convey that initial sense of completeness. During the process of writing, when the work in progress often fails to convey any of its original intentions, the writer must sometimes be sustained by simple faith. A faith that, in the end, the process of writing will result in a natural balance between inspiration and finished form. Part of the reason faith is such a necessary part of the process is that writing, like time, is bound to the limitations of its own measure. Just as the present, limited always by the point at which it is drawn, opens onto that further, far less substantial element, the future, so language opens at every moment onto the possibility of renewed interpretation, even as it remains bound to the limitations of its set form. The challenge and the joy of writing, as I see it, is the same as the challenge and the joy of living consciously at any time in history. The simultaneous sense of being tied to an inevitable past and the impulsive longing to be free of it. Literary writing grapples with, indeed embodies, our double investment in history and innovation, resignation and challenge, situated as we always are at the crossroads, a waterline between the past and the future. If writing is understood in this way, however, as an indefinite, ongoing process, it follows that the inspiration behind a particular work, the initial moment that made you, as it were, catch your breath, is never completely expelled. Perhaps, indeed, the real task of a writer is not to fully, finally express herself, but rather to formalize a space within the completed text for that original inspiration, a sort of conceptual holding in of breath. My own process in the first months after conceiving the idea for The Sentimentalists was, in contrast, a steady, uninterrupted exhale. I did not look back over what I had written, but day after day, picking up whatever thread I had left hanging the day before, proceeded toward what seemed at that stage a happily realizable end. It was with surprise, as well as a fair bit of dismay, that after 6 months of steady writing, I assessed the amount of work still left to do in order to shape the material I'd produced into something that even resembled a novel, let alone one that matched my original vision. Much to his credit, when I submitted the manuscript to my thesis supervisor at Concordia University, he was far less alarmed by its size and state of confusion than I was. A writer of sharp, sparse prose with many more years of experience behind him, he was accustomed to the necessary rigors of editing. Though at times the process could feel violent or even cruel, as though I were in fact working against the inspiration and the time invested in the work in progress, I came very quickly to learn that the editing stage was in fact the most essential to realizing my novel's initial intent. With guidance, I whittled my manuscript down to roughly half of its original size, and a few years later I reduced it to roughly half again. Only then did I prepare myself to answer the tougher questions about detail and structure, or to consider finally how to construct within the work, a space that might retain my original motivation to write it at all. At the end of this process, when I asked myself the question of what my novel was really about, I felt I could say with some confidence that it was indeed about the shudder of a realization I'd had during the summer of 2003 as I floated over Flagstaff Lake. A realization not only of the constitutive nature of the past in the present, but also, and consequently, of the tremendous depth and infinite richness of the world. When last summer I began to my second novel, that's also outdated, so a lot longer ago than that, I remember thinking that I would go about it very differently. This time I thought it would be less a process of trial and error and more a concentrated, considered effort from beginning to end. Instead, I have found the experience so far to be remarkably similar, and at this stage in the writing process I am needing once again to sustain myself on simple faith. It may be that, like history itself, the history of a particular work of literature is governed by the twin impulses of an endless forward momentum and a retrograde revisionist desire. For me, the real challenge and opportunity that writing presents is that of moving between these two impulses in search of that delicate balance between the exuberant momentum of the present as it moves ever hopefully toward the future, and the dedicated focus, hard work, and resignation with which we submit to and endlessly revise the past. So just before I open it up to your questions, I just want to share with you one more small thought, which is outside of this piece, but was inspired by a talk that I saw last year presented at the University of Arizona in Tucson. It was the critic and cultural theorist Gayatri Spivak, whose work many of you are probably familiar with. She's probably most famous for her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, and also her translations of Derrida. She came to speak at the U of A actually on a very specific, practical and urgent matter regarding the decision by the state of Arizona to ban Mexican study classes in Arizona schools. And it's precisely that which the words that I'm going to share with you that she shared with us were particularly moving to me, because as I sort of touch on in the talk that I just read, what's so fascinating to me about the process of writing and literature in general is a split always between sort of the real and the ideal, the practical element, language that the writing is bound with, the reality of the world that we live in, and the imagination. So I was impressed by the way that Spivak was able to balance her discussion between the theoretical and the practical without disregarding one or the other, but moved instead through the difficult terrain that any informed discussion needs to take, which necessarily includes both. She had been invited to speak at the U of A through the Spanish and Portuguese departments, and she spoke first of her love for literature. In one discussion, she said, "I want to remain the sort of innocent that loves literature." By saying this, she did not mean to suggest in the least that she is not or does not want to be invested in the practical realities of the everyday world. In fact, the very opposite. What she meant was, as she went on to say, that what literature offers us is a space of thinking that is neither rational nor irrational, that makes no truth claims. The advice she gave to the hundreds of young students that came looking for some practical answers to the problem of unabashed racism and censorship that they are faced with in Arizona is advice that I would like to echo today. She said that we need to carve out in our present moment a space not for the past as such, but for the to come, in French, the avenir. What is necessary in order to conceptualize this space is that same openness which is inherent to the project of learning. And I don't mean here just the acquisition of degrees or of information. I mean instead a space of genuine attention, a space like that offered by literature and forums of active learning like the Neely series. Makes no truth claims, but instead, as Spivak said, is the training ground of the mind for the ethical reflex. So on that note, I'd like to thank the Neely series again for what you do, for inviting me here, and to all of you for listening. Thank you.